This week, we welcome Davi Ottenheimer to the show to discuss how data integrity lights the way in fixing security with decentralized web. Then in the security news, crypto miners using text to P2P messenger command and control server. That just rolled off the tongue. 8-year-old Linux kernel flaw dirty cred is as nasty or nastier as dirty pipe. Janet Jackson music video gives it a CVE for crashing laptops. And so much more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cybercriminals are hiding in the conversation. Cybercriminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified these 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
Oh, hey. Sorry, couldn't hear the ad running, so. Welcome to the show! Yeah, or something. Hey, first, let me introduce you to a man who also may have a nasty, dirty pipe. Mr. Possidorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode 753, recorded on August 24th, 2022, right here in G-Unit Studios. Need to clean our pipes, apparently. Mr.
Wow.
Larry Pesce is here with me. Welcome, Larry.
Thanks, Paul. Good to be here again.
Yeah, it's nice to have you.
Yeah.
And we have another in-studio personality with us. Mr. Jason Albuquerque is here with us in studio. Nice to have you, dude.
Man, we've been spending a lot of time together. You never told me you had a dirty pipe.
Some new vulnerability. And we need to get some Drano.
Yep, definitely some Drano.
On the lines remotely, Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
How's it going, guys? Miss your face. Jason, good to see you, buddy.
What's happening,
Decided
my
to join
friend?
the big boy show, huh?
That's it. Have to step up my game.
Tyler's got a little lag in his video.
A lot of lag.
It was very Kung Fu movie-ish.
Magic Kung Fu right there.
Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us. Josh, welcome.
Happy to be here as always, my friend.
From the
It's gonna be a good
garage.
night.
You were in the garage? Is that what I heard you say earlier?
Yeah, we actually, when we bought the house, I'm converting the detached garage to an office for myself, as well as storage for the grills and the garden stuff and everything else. Hey, I get my own space. I'm happy.
In your own man shed or man garage, man cave,
Man garage.
man
Hey,
garage.
detached 3-car garage. It's nice.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Good for you, man.
That's exactly 4-car garage enough space.
That's right. For all of your stuff,
Like,
right?
what I'm saying is your garage short for all the stuff you're going to...
I know.
Security Weekly listeners can save 20% on InfoSec World 2022 passes. InfoSec World will be held September 27th through the 29th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW and use the code ISW22-SecWeek20 to secure your spot. If you have a specific guest or topic you'd like us to cover on one of the upcoming shows, submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests. We review those on a monthly basis, and we'll reach out once we've reviewed your submission. Davi Ottenheimer is the VP of Trust and Digital Ethics at Interrupt. Davi's current role involves developing and implementing real-world decentralization technology with ethics at their core integrity to help the web as beneficial and trustworthy as possible. Davi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's interrupt, not interrupt, but I'll take interrupt or interrupt.
Interrupt? Did I say that correct? The second
Interrupt. So interrupt.
Interrupt. Right? Did I get that right? Sorry, I don't have my glasses on.
No.
You should probably put your glasses on.
Well, my glasses are for seeing my screen, not for seeing the teleprompter. So Tommy, I apologize.
The New England accent doesn't help.
No, certainly not. Well, Davi, again, thanks for coming on the show. I want to first ask you, how did you get your start in information security?
Well, there's the start, and then there's the pre-start, I guess. All the years I spent as a student just mucking about, back in the 80s, as probably a lot of people tell this story, as a kid, getting in trouble. I was on Sun systems. I was on early VMS systems. But once I got through school, I was just basically finishing my master's degree, and one of my advisors was like, "You're so much into the computer stuff, you might as well just go for it. Come back and do a PhD if you want." But really, computers seem to be your calling. So I just, $50 in my pocket, flew out to California and walked into a place and said, "Hey, I like computers." And they hired me on the spot, and I immediately started taking everything apart. And that included, back then, Windows NT 3.5. We were rolling out TCP/IP, and it was all dumpster fire. It was all hacked almost immediately, all kinds of security incidents constantly, and it just came naturally at that point. That was 94.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, as you said, Davi, implementing technology in the 90s, we had to learn security because everything was being hacked remotely very easily, right?
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, when I was in college, we were doing all kinds of stuff like that anyway. I mean, it's weird today to talk about people on social media because back in, I don't remember, what was it, like 89, 90, we were on phone on Unix, or we were using chat, we were doing all the IRC. It was very much the same as today. I feel like I've been in Groundhog Day, essentially, for 30 years. But it was always security for me at the very beginning. I was always getting in trouble with all kinds of things. Just went from amateur to professional. At some point there's a transition. Basically, when I gave up trying to be an academic and became, I realized I could be a historian and be like one of 10 positions in the world I'd be fighting with 1,000 people to get for no pay, or I could be the worst security person in the world and be doing quite well for myself. That's basically the proposition, as sad as it sounds.
Now, what were you going to school for if it wasn't computers back in the day?
I studied international history, and I focused on the Horn of Africa. I did a master's degree on the 1940 to 43 repatriation of Haile Selassie, so military history, essentially, which was disinformation. It was Ord Wingate's model of the Mission 101 to take a few people, push them into a country using very clever disinformation and special forces techniques and push out hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Wow. It's interesting how we sometimes speak of disinformation that's happening today like it's something new. I mean, and you've just dated it very far back in history, right?
Oh yeah, it goes back thousands of years. I mean, I actually have a page in my master's thesis that is the disinformation pamphlet that was dropped out of the planes over Ethiopia. So I studied a lot of it. In fact, a lot of World War II was about disinformation. I wrote a piece actually recently about Operation Mincemeat. I wrote one about the Beersheba campaign. In World War I, the British dropped a bloodied saddlebag in the desert, which the Ottomans picked up and read and believed was true, but it was actually all false information that was planted by the British. And that was how the Middle East was won, basically.
Davi, how much of your master's thesis, of your studies, actually influenced your work with Inrupt? I'm really curious.
It's not direct from the master's thesis, but there's a weird synergy here because, the company was started by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the web, and his background is basically Oxford and CERN. And so by joining the company and starting to go into the motions of talking about the web, which has been my whole career, right? I started my entire career at the time the web started. I've worked in security on the web the entire time. And so being from the London School of Economics, where I did my master's degree, and focusing on international history of information dissemination, information power, it's kind of all very related. We even did a meeting in Oxford where I felt like, ooh, I've come home to roost. Like I feel like those 30 years just got compressed. Boom. Like I walked out of my master's degree and I'm right, all of a sudden, boom, doing the same exact thing I was doing back then, but it's of much more magnitude. I mean, as a student, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I figured I was useless to the world as a historian. But today I feel like if you're not studying history, what are you even doing? Like the history degree is probably the most important degree right now for understanding information warfare, for understanding things like deepfakes, for understanding analytics of integrity. So the degree is about reading huge amounts of information and figuring out what is truth.
Yeah, I when I read the description of the decentralization and and so on and so forth. Like, and you talked about your degree in misinformation and explaining how misinformation was such a huge part of the world. Like, that just went ping, and it's fascinating. I mean, how many of us on this show have said, for years we've been saying, do the fundamentals. For years we've been saying, get it right, do the simple stuff. And you're right. If you don't, what was that quote? If you those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it.
Right. Those who know their history are condemned to watch others repeat it. Which is my take on Tesla. I watch Tesla and I go, who allows this company to exist? Who wants a Tesla? I hope none of you own Teslas, because I constantly talk about the problem with Tesla being a problem that dates back to the beginnings of fraud, and it's a terrible, terrible example of how technology, just because it's new and there's a domain shift and it seems exciting and different, somehow it gets given a pass where anybody who looked at history would be like, oh, we definitely shouldn't be doing this.
Davi, what's wrong with Tesla? Because I'm in the market and I haven't made a decision. So what are your thoughts on Tesla?
It's so much. So 2016, I did a presentation. It was like a keynote at B-Sides in Vegas, where I basically said this car does not have the technology it promises to, and it's going to kill a lot of people. That's 2016. And since then, I've written probably 100 blog posts on exactly how bad it is. The latest one is Tesla announces they're going to suck their customers dry before they kill them, basically. It's this race to basically get as much money as possible out of the people that actually fall for their scam before they're tragically lost in an accident. To me, it's a 419 scam. I've studied for decades. I've studied the 419 advanced fee fraud scam that's known as the Nigerian email, where they say, if you give us a little bit of money, then eventually you'll get riches from an African prince. You literally have a South African bazillionaire, like a prince, saying, if you give me $15,000 now for technology that doesn't exist and doesn't do what it's supposed to do, eventually you'll get something which is an appreciable asset. Those are his words, that he says, you will get back an appreciable asset if you give me a bit of your money. To me, it's an entire fraud. And the car is the worst quality technology in the entire industry.
Yeah, well, and there's some other issues there. I've also heard that Tesla plans to buy back the cars and just turn them into automated vehicles. Is there any basis to that claim?
I think the first thing to understand about Tesla, and this comes from a person who studies disinformation techniques, for a long, long time. I've always been in this field, looking at integrity as one of the core attributes. Three legs of the stool in security: integrity, confidentiality, availability. The first 10 years of my career were working on availability. The second 10 years of my career working on confidentiality, built a bunch of encryption systems, key management systems, all kinds of stuff I'm proud of. This last leg of the stool, this integrity thing, is where we're weakest in security. And so the first thing to understand about Tesla is they just game the integrity all the time. Basically everything they say is premised on lies, and it comes through very quickly. So 2019, they said we'll have, by the end of 2020, fully automated, completely autonomous driving. You don't even need a steering wheel. Absolutely not true. And then you find that they pivot from that into saying, well, we're going to have taxis that are completely autonomous by 2020, 2021. Absolutely not true. And then they just repeat this, like they play it back and they play it again every couple of years to get people excited and investing. And it's none of it's true. None of it. And it's crazy to me that they can get away with such lies. They're actually decreasing the capability of their cars. What we're seeing now is that the cars are more likely to have accidents. When they did a recall recently, and there was a forced recall at the end of 2021, the incidents related to the recall actually jumped and went up after the recall. That's how bad the patch was. It's just crazy to me. This car is such garbage. I can't even get. I refer you to my blog, which is separate than what we should be talking about. But we are talking about integrity.
Yeah.
So.
No,
I have one more question on
Welcome
this.
to Motor Trend Weekly.
And that is, you're not against the concept of electric vehicles. You're against the way that Tesla's doing it.
Yeah, that's the same. I'm not against vehicles at all. I'm against Henry Ford. I mean, I think the man was a lunatic. He bought a newspaper. Here's a good example of disinformation. He literally took over a newspaper the way Elon Musk is talking about taking over Twitter. And then he put anti-Semitic literature in every single one of his dealerships and convinced people like Hitler and Goebbels that what they should do is try to kill all the Jews. That was Henry Ford. I'm not against vehicles. I'm against Henry Ford. The man was a lunatic.
Davi, I just want to...
Again, if you study history, you see Elon Musk taking over Twitter and you go, oh yeah, I remember when Henry Ford started a newspaper.
But those who remember their history are destined to watch people repeat it. What was that? Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Davi, I just wanted to ask you about your time when you served as head of security. Was that during the confidentiality phase of your career?
As head of security, I've done head of security a lot. I don't know.
Yeah, tell us about that. What was what did you learn that kind of led you to where you're at today?
Well, I mean, I think that I'm a very curious person, and I think the technology to me, I've talked about this in another podcast, and I think I've written it up somewhere. It's like I grew up in very rural America, rural part of Kansas, and to me, technology was like looking at the tractor in the fields and thinking, okay, that's a transformation. You know, the industrialization of the agricultural sector clearly came about through this machine being implemented in ways to replace people. And right away, as a small boy, I saw that the computer, I mean, literally like in the late 70s, early 80s, my father was doing computational analysis of kinship. He was doing family modeling of anthropology using computers. And so I was exposed to it, and I thought, man, the computer is just like the future of all information. It's just clearly like the tractor of information. So I was fascinated and curious. I like to take things apart, put them back together. Spent a lot of time in cars, taking them apart, putting things back together, motorcycles, all that stuff. And so the computer was just such a natural fit. And then security comes, for me, IT is economics, which was interesting to me, like who gets a machine and who gets power, who gets more cores, who gets more memory, all that stuff. But really the part that fascinated me more than just the economics of who should get the power and how much of power that, you know, who gets the tractor to plow the field was the ethics of it. And that was where security really fit. So IT to me is economics, but security is really ethics. And I wanted to understand how the balance of power shifted and how people were abusing their access. So they were given the tools to do something, but they did something else with it, which elevated them or gave them privileges far beyond what they were supposed to be doing. Not many people realize, for example, that hacking in America really goes back to ranchers who were taking the early telegraph wires and, well, telephone wires, which they became, and extending them into their fields, right? Barbed wire, for example, was made out of telegraph wires. I don't know many people that know that, but they were producing huge amounts of telegraph wires, and then people twisted it and put a barb on it, and that's how barbed wire was invented. And then so when you put telephone lines out into the fields, well, they could just use barbed wire, they could use those lines. So they started hacking right into the phone lines right away in the rural communities. Rural communities are sort of the basis, the foundation of hacking in America. So I feel like I came at it from a natural angle. You make stuff work because you have limited resources and you have all the time in the world to bang on it.
Go ahead, Josh.
I will tell you, I think you've got that backwards. Davi, barbed wire was made into telegraph wire and telephone wire because they found that they had a long strand of wire that was already, they could put on Coke bottle or glass insulators and they could use it as a telephone line. But they didn't make it out of telegraph wire. It's very different. It's different metallurgically. I'm sorry, but I'm a bit of a historian myself, and I actually did a lot of work in the 1880s to 1910 era, and I'm like, that's backwards. So forgive me. I'm not trying to.
Josh is our barbed wire historian expert, Davi.
Yeah, I'd love to go to it.
I worked as a blacksmith in a historic village. I actually made some of the first, replicas of some of the first barbed wire by hand. And
and some of the first barbed wire wasn't in Kansas. I'd be happy to go into it. So one of the things that they did was they generated a huge amount of the wire very quickly. And so they would generate huge amounts of spools of the wire. And so that was where the excess came from. And people realized that they could make it by twisting it and then putting barbs on it into these barbed wire fences. So it was the economics of the telegraph wires being so readily available that led to them being turned into fences, which then led into the barbs. Not all barbed wire, of course. There's many types of barbed wire. In fact, in Kansas, you can find museums of the stuff where there's just walls of different types.
Literally, absolutely, metals. Yeah, there's patents. Barbed wire, there's many different types of barbed wire that's actually patented. I did not know that until, while I was doing this. I'm like, wait, there's patented barbed wire? Yeah, there's thousands of patents of different types of barbs.
Oh, yeah.
For cows, for horses, for goats, for sheep. And then there's somebody's like, the improved version. And then, version number 3, like, all the crap we do with, this type of CRM or antivirus or whatever. And then it's the improved version. And it's the new version.
Right.
Same stuff.
Right, and the transition for me was the IT, the economics of barbed wire back then, and that's the patents come into that, was people were trying to make money and trying to produce versions of it that sort of like reduced the cost of fences, and that's why they wanted to get in on the action. Because it went dramatically down from like natural berms to stone walls so the cost of fencing was plummeting, and barbed wire was a big, post a stone was a good example of that. You put a stone and then you run wire for hundreds of feet, and it was way faster and way cheaper than anything that had come before it. And so that was interesting. But what became more interesting to me was not the economics of huge amounts of wire being available and very easy to make it very for cows, for example, make it very to put the barbs on to make it very effective in stopping things from moving about, but that it was then transitioned into concentration camps. And so that's the ethics of it, was the use of the barbed wire in other ways. And so if you put together the repeating rifle and you put together the barbed wire, the inexpensive fencing, and you put together the combustion engine, what you're able to do is see a transition in technology where people suddenly are very, the power dynamic changes. People are suddenly very able to amass power by having a single person with a weapon who's able to move a lot of people very quickly into a contained area. And none of those three technologies were probably meant for those uses, but put together, that's where genocide came from.
And
modern genocide.
Does that translate today into how our data is being treated and the ethics behind that?
Exactly. And that's the problem with the history, is I see a lot of these parallels. And so if you wonder about digital moats, for example, where people talk about centralizing and containing people in a way they can control them and extract value from them, you have to wonder, what's the ethics of this? Not the economics. A lot of the discussions around the economics, especially in Silicon Valley, where you talk to some of the people who are investors and they say, what's the best way to build the next digital moat? But if you switch over into the ethics of it and you say, is that really where people's data should be, is in these places they can't get out of, where extraction of value is coming to others and not even back to the people themselves? And there's clear precedent for this in history. And so that's where, for me, it's unfortunately a tragic discussion, but you end up talking about plantation ethics, colonialism, imperialism, right? You talk about places that people were trapped and all the value extracted from them.
But I mean, not only do we trap them, but we give them the perception of value. And I use this example all the time with my wife and her Dunkin' Donuts card, right? Where she's like, I get free coffee if I sign up for this app and I let them scan it. And I'm like, sweetie, you realize that coffee's not free, that like you put in some information to get that, and they're probably selling your data on the back end, and therefore your coffee's not free. She's like, but no, like I get free coffee and I'm going to use the app. I'm like, oh, can we help?
See, now it would be different.
Go ahead, Davi.
So it would be different if this exchange, like where she thought she was getting something free and giving something, were actually just the exchange. But part of the problem is that, as you are basically hinting at, you're getting yourself into a trap you can't get out of. And sometimes we call this the graveyard of past consents. A guy I work with now, Elliot Bahar, I've known him for a long time, fantastic lawyer, works in the human rights space, which is key to this, right? You have to have some background or perspective from the human rights angle. And so when you get into technology with a human rights background, you look at this and say, wait a minute, if you've consented to something, but you can't get out of it, you're like tombstoned in a way that you're basically forever going to be held to that. It's not a fair deal. Now, if she could change that, so there's some sort of arbitration mechanism using the technology to where she consents but then removes consent later, now we're talking about an actual deal where the power doesn't shift and is always taken away and forever gone. You can actually pull some of it back and say, yeah, I made that deal, but I want to get out of the deal now. I want to get some coffee for some information, but I want to... In fact, it moves on to this idea that people could consent on a regular basis, which really improves the integrity of the information, which is what I wanted to talk about today. You can get into a relationship with businesses where you want to help the business by giving them the best integrity information possible, because that's the relationship you're in. You want them to be successful because they provide something you value, right? They value the right information. Mm-hmm. All of that's falling apart because we're basically in a situation where we don't know where the information is going to go, so we intentionally poison it. We give people bogus information constantly to try to evade the fact that we might be stuck with it forever.
There's a distrust that we have with it, and I don't want to say not an open relationship, but it's not a good relationship that we have with folks with which we share data, right? I think there's some distrust. I mean, that was some of the premise behind GDPR, right? Was I don't trust the company to have my data anymore. I want the ability to pull it out. Is that some of the ethics behind this too?
Yeah, GDPR is a fascinating case because it's rooted in IBM's role in the Holocaust. Not a lot of people really understand that IBM had a fundamental role in doing the tabulations of the death camps, right? So Dachau was running on the IBM tabulation machines that were using punch cards basically to keep track of people, to kill them all. And so GDPR comes out of this concept in Germany, or Europe generally, but in Germany in particular, where going around and taking everyone's personal information down can lead to them being put into a camp and killed. So you want to have some sense of privacy that protects them from that kind of atrocity. So GDPR is really rooted in some clear technology precedent. Like if the IBMs of that day become what today would be a massive processor who's using that information to oppress people, that's exactly where GDPR steps in and says you shouldn't be holding people, against their will or processing their information against their best interests or intents. So if you really look at it from that lens, then GDPR isn't some new thing that just came about that's ruining our markets. It's something that came about a long time ago because of a clear problem in how technology was abused and used unethically, immorally. One of the weird tangents of the whole IBM story, incidentally, is that after World War II, IBM successfully got the United States to not only return the money they were owed for payment for this stuff, but they got the machines back too. It's like they really made a lot of money on this stuff and nobody really ever held them accountable. There's a book about it, but that's the most anyone's really ever done.
That's certainly an ethical dilemma for sure.
Yeah. Well, so you get into this question of privacy and it gets into, I want to give you my information, but obviously I don't want to be held to it forever. Like if I default on a lemonade stand when I'm 5 years old, I don't want to be denied a loan when I'm 55 and having no money my entire life. Or if I have a false felony arrest, I don't want that to percolate through the system and then have to spend my life chasing it down and getting rid of it, erasing this false accusation. This actually came to me, back to your point about my background, I was in an African country, actually, at a very important meeting, and I had a police force for an entire country asking me, this is over a decade ago, okay, fine, you can give us high availability. You can break through the problems we've had about getting information spread around the country. So fascinating problems, how do you do this over whatever latency or low speeds and weather issues? Okay, we fix the availability. Okay, you can give us the confidentiality so our databases are safe. But what if we make the records wrong and we do something wrong to someone and we spread that all over the country and that person gets arrested or even killed? How do you protect us from that? This was an actual, executives at government level in this country. It must have been 2012 or something like that. And my mind was just like, oh my God. I mean, we've got nothing. I've got nothing. Tripwire was the closest thing I'd ever seen to doing any kind of integrity check. Maybe we can hash something, but we still have to have a valid. And that's the transition in my mind where I was like, whoa, this goes right back to what I started in, which was, how did the United States land in North Africa and push their way in and displace all of the Nazis through all these disinformation campaigns? They're fundamental to the American experience in getting rid of the Nazis, was restoring balance where there's been so much misinformation. So that's really where we're at.
And what you just hinted at, Davi, was the integrity problem that you spoke of earlier, right? That storing the data and who controls the data is one thing, but the integrity of that data is important in that if someone changes that data, it could have repercussions and hurt people. Absolutely vital, especially in IoT.
There's an amazing presentation by Ross Anderson about 2017 or 18 or something like that, where he starts to talk about safety, where security and safety collide. And that's where you actually drop confidentiality because integrity is more important. Mm-hmm. If someone's going to die because you have bad information, you don't want it to be an encrypted chat where no one can get in and change that information. That's a disaster. And that's exactly what we started to see with platforms like Facebook, is that they went so hard into the false promise. Basically the fraud of encryption at the time was to, if you can close it up and make it completely secure from an encryption standpoint, then it must be better for the world. And actually that turns out to be not the case because you have this inherent conflict. It's like availability and confidentiality. If I want to get rid of something, make it disappear, I'm in conflict with availability. If I want something to always be available, then I don't want the best privacy. And so you get the same with integrity. If I have this absolute privacy mantra of encryption end to end all the time, and then you go, wait a minute, you're spreading lies and they're actually very, very dangerous and they're getting people killed. Then, and like I said, Ross Anderson sort of pointing this out, is like safety sometimes trumps your need to get in there and prevent people from seeing what's going on or what people are talking about. And that's in IoT, that's huge. I mean, you talk about robots, you talk about cars, you talk about any automation. I've actually been hired by some very large global organizations that have lost control of their robots. I gave a presentation about this where I said it's kind of like Blade Runner, where they're like, hey, can you come in and kill the robot? Mm-hmm. We've lost control of it. It's really spooky.
How do we balance that privacy and transparency, right? Mm-hmm. Because so many people are worried about and I look at it from the consumer side of the aisle, right? So many of the social media platforms, you talked about companies like Dunkin' Donuts taking our information, and we focus on, as a consumer, I want to make sure my data has a level of privacy to it.
I see you've got Dunkin' Donuts over there.
I do, 100%.
Did you have the app, or did
I pay cash.
Yeah.
I pay cash. But we also, like government, right? We always fight government about the transparency of what they're doing with our information. We have open meeting laws. We have all of these laws around transparency.
Right.
Where's that balance between protecting my information but opening up that transparency so I know what you're doing? I mean, you talked about your wife in the Dunkin' Donuts app. I am sure she had to check a box to say something when she downloaded that app. Nobody's reading that.
No.
Nobody's reading what they're doing with the data. What they're saying is, I'm getting a service. It's making it convenient for me so I can order my coffee, walk in, grab it, and leave, or go through the drive-through. I'm getting this level of a service that makes my life more efficient. But what are we giving up for that?
Yeah, perceived.
What are we giving up for that? We're giving up a lot for that, right?
Tyler.
Yeah, I was going to say you're also running into the problem of unintended consequences and cascading effects, not just to you, but say something like your children. Look at the CRISPR databases, all these 23andMe. Yeah, all that data is getting parsed, all that's getting saved, archived, and record. What happens in 20 years or 10 years when your kids try and get a life insurance and you have precursors for cancer or one of the other diseases that we haven't cured yet? Now we're having unintended consequences for data that we've not thought about, that is longstanding, going to live forever, and is part of the scientific community for better, but also can be used for monetization by large companies. These are things that are critical.
Tyler, dead on. My brain went to Ancestry.com and DNA testing. They're taking people's DNA, sticking it in a database, and who's to say that because of my DNA, my kids 10 years from now aren't going to suffer because of what's there? Higher insurance, higher whatever, right?
In all seriousness,
Yes.
You know who owns all those services?
Yes.
Who?
That is the back-end ad corporation for ad tracking data.
The Mormons.
That's one of them. But even that.
Seriously, they own Ancestry.com. They own, I believe, a big chunk of 23andMe. They own.
Who's funding them though for the backing of those?
They have a $42 billion set of corporations as their backup fund.
140.
They don't need any funding. 142 billion. I'm so sorry. Forgive me.
You're 100. You're 100
Off by $100 billion.
$100 billion. Come on, it's pocket change for you, Tyler. You lost a $13 million flash drive in your house. Come on, it's pocket change. So it's what's going on is that, and I'm not saying this to denigrate Mormons in any way, shape, or form. I think that tracking people's ancestry and genealogy is fascinating. Provides a lot of people a wonderful, wonderful connection to their history. Don't get me wrong. But what's interesting is what you've got then is you've got a very, very concentrated database of DNA data.
Yeah.
At that point, 2 generations from now, they go, hey, look, somebody related to this DNA is a murderer, is a cousin of a friend of a whatever. Point is that you're right. It can implicate your children. It can implicate their on something they haven't been around. DNA sticks around for a while.
What happens when our government collapses too, and now we are no longer a fair democratic government? And this happened during World War II. We had Nazis that were looking at ethnic markers. Mm-hmm. Like now we have much more clear ethnic markers. We can't always say we're going to live in a free country, that we are always going to have a perfect society and a system that does not discriminate against those things. So building these massive stores of information on individuals in no way, shape, or form is ever going to be something that is going to be good for the longevity.
I want to go to Davi and get your thoughts on Mormons, Ancestry.com, and the downfall of society.
I've already insulted every Tesla owner, so I might as well go for it.
In other news, the bounty on Davi's head has now gone up by $100 billion.
Are there any Mormon Tesla owners, just before I get into it? So I think that, the issue here is actually spot on. So what you're talking about, and that's why I allude back to the Nazis, GDPR, link, and IBM, is the centralization is a problem because it links to authorization, the authority over the information that's been centralized. And there's all sorts of problems historically from that perspective. I mean, one of the interesting cases is in Austria, where they had like a card file for every single person in the entire city of Vienna. You can actually see some evidence of these card files where spies were hired to wander around the street, just keep track of everything that everyone did, everything they knew about them, write them down with like a fountain pen, like ink, and then put them into files. The FBI did this in the United States famously. And so just the idea of this constant surveillance of everything you do beyond who you are, but all of your actions as well, has been problematic throughout history for a lot of different organizations, a lot of different religions, a lot of different instances. We could study, like, there's many examples. So I don't want to focus necessarily on the Mormons and their role in this, but I do want to take it back a step and say, wait a minute, what if we don't centralize, right? What if we look at things that have happened throughout history to rebalance, essentially take away control from over-centralization, especially when that centralization is led by an organization that is highly controlled, has a highly hierarchical structure. And so that's when we talk about the web, for example, as a massive decentralization exercise and giving people the ability to publish information. The United States, famously under Andrew Jackson, was a white police state that was inspecting all mail, right? Andrew Jackson, as president, gave the order to his postmaster general to open all the letters and try to find all the abolitionists and go hang them. And then if you got off a boat in a shipyard in the South during that time and you had a book that was contraband, they'd take you into a jail cell and torture you and find out who all of your friends were and try to... So the United States has a terrible track record in terms of this sort of stuff and trying to figure out, who you are, what race you are, what background you are, how much blackness do you have in your history to decide whether or not you get social entry, are you white enough, that kind of stuff.
Davi,
so when you think about it,
it's not interrogation, it's not torture, it's enhanced interrogation. Come on.
Exactly. Exactly. And so when you think about these episodes in history where people try to say, like, okay, if you just trust the government to that extent and the government turns bad, what's the recourse? And a lot of it is the decentralization. My point there is that the printing press was a huge effect on the abolitionist movement, right? The fact that you could push literature into the South and get things published inexpensively. And the South saw that as a threat. They used to, burn down printing presses. The mobs would go in and throw the presses into the river and kill everybody who was trying to print the literature. And so the web as a modern form of literature dissemination and information dissemination as a decentralized model is a big, has a big role in this. For example, 23andMe may claim that they have some absolute information or knowledge, but you can always challenge that. If you have some other way of getting information out, that would be more accurate. And so what if you took the web and extended it into a way that you can now again disseminate information, but much more accurately to represent oneself? And that's the SOLID protocol.
Yeah,
and that's why it's so exciting.
Is that the premise of the SOLID protocol? And did you help develop that, Davi?
I did not. No, Tim Berners-Lee, again, worked on the SOLID protocol in MIT is where they incubated it as he was working there. Yeah.
And is that the goal of the SOLID project, is to decentralize the data? And I think we've given some good examples of how centralization of the data can have bad ramifications, but decentralizing it, we need some mechanism to do that so that we are in fact in control of our own data. Is that one of the goals?
That's exactly right. If you use a Venn diagram, you have apps, and you have identities, and then you have the data. And so I worked at, for example, at EMC, where I was going around the world helping some of the largest organizations. I can't even name them, but the largest data organizations in the world were trying to find ways of abstracting a lot of the work away from the data. So in other words, if you wrote something, where would it go? Well, you would abstract it in the way virtualization works. So you sort of hypervise it and you end up putting it wherever you want it to be. So it could go into the cloud, it could go into Amazon, it could go into Azure, it could go into your local USB drive, it could go to... So if you have that kind of abstraction, it's extremely powerful. And so SOLID is another manifestation of this concept where you have basically an open standard. That's why it's so powerful. So Tim working on this is so important because he really fundamentally gets why the open standards work, why they win, why TCP wins, for example, instead of X25 and stuff like that. So you end up getting into this open standard where anybody can write an app, grab an identity from any source, which gets at the idea of authentication authorization again, like who has the authority, and then store the data. And because you decouple it, you can take your data anywhere and you can represent it with any identity and you can connect any app to it. There's a simple example. If we were playing a chess game and we stored the moves, my moves are in my pod, personal data store, your moves are in yours, we can rip out the app and put it in another app and continue right in the middle of a game. We can also not have the other person's moves, but we can still reconstruct everything that happened. So I'm storing only my moves, but I can probably figure out your moves. So there's all kinds of power in allowing people to write applications in a more open way, allowing people to decouple their identities so they're no longer in these digital modes that are essentially imprisonment, and take their data and manifest it in ways that it really expands, just like the web blew open the doors on the market and technology, it really expands where we can go with the technology.
Because our data is stored in so many different places. Today, it's next to impossible to go find out where all those places are and then go through the work of actually trying to remove it and or change it from all those different data stores.
Yeah, there's two angles on this. Again, the history of finding out where all the information about you, if you look at it, that's what intelligence agencies basically do, is they go find out every instance, everything that you've ever done, and they try to figure out a picture of who you are, which is what a lot of the platforms are promising to do, right? They're saying they can get integrity of the individual as a means to advertising to you. And so they're trying to capture you by putting you into one place so they can monitor absolutely everything you do. But intelligence agencies are much more intelligent than that because, as the name implies, they go out and find everything that you've ever done anywhere. So it's not that it's not impossible. It's just expensive, and the cost is going down rapidly. And there's actually tools that will go out and find every instance that you've ever had of you anywhere in the entire. I worked with a company that was a spin out of the CIA a long time ago. It must have been 2000 or 2001. And their premise was that they'd find everything that was ever said about you for businesses. And so you can monitor your brand reputation to see if anyone's saying anything bad about you. Now, fast forward to today, and what I argue is GDPR is often framed as the right to be forgotten, but that's digital suicide. And I don't want to tell anyone that they should go around trying to get everyone to forget them, because that's essentially erasing yourself. While it is a right to be forgotten, I think the better way of phrasing it is the right to be understood. And so if you were able to clean up and monitor and manage the perception of yourself by having a way to figure out where all that information was, but establish provenance and say, this data store is me. I exist, not separate from me, not somewhere else. No digital twins, me. I hate the idea of a digital twin, because that to me just smells of exploitation. You take this thing and you put it over there, and now you can do whatever you want to it because it's my twin, but it's not me. That gets back into the ethics. That's an economic argument for exploitation. I don't like that at all. So instead, you get rid of the twins. And you just
Davi, that's ridiculous. That is not an exploitative argument. It's a representation. Just as cash in your hand back when the gold standard was representative of a gold dollar or gold bar or gold whatever. I mean, it's representative. Davi, that's crazy. You can't be serious.
I'm serious. I think the digital twin is a way of exploitation. It's a way of getting away from the actual impact of what you're doing to the thing that you're affecting. So you call it a digital twin so you can do worse things to it.
I think without something there, though, I mean, if you look at in the inverse, without something there, then that can also be exploited and or manipulated without your consent. So therefore it is being exploited. I kind of have to agree.
If you trace it back to the individual, then the things that are happening to you are ultimately in your decision, your sphere of influence. You're saying, well, this is happening to me and I want to agree or disagree to it. But you spin it out and you put it somewhere else and you get too disassociated from it, you lose control over it, and then that's where things happen and you don't know.
But isn't it like anything? It's about the integrity of what you're creating. So if I'm creating a digital twin of something and I know it has integrity to it, I can trust it, right? So it's about making sure that it has a level of integrity to it, that it can't be.
So a good example of this was
that's inferring a twin, though, right? That's identical reference. If there is a slight discrepancy in that, where they look very similar,
no longer
but
a twin, right?
It's no longer a twin, but that's how it would be exploited.
Yeah, but I like this because I didn't hack that. My digital twin hacked that. So good. Hey.
But you need some level of that validation of integrity, right? To ensure it is actually a digital twin.
Yeah, and this is the deep philosophical problem of replicants and all that stuff. I mean, it's the basis of Blade Runner and ultimately trying to figure out what is real, what isn't real. Deep philosophical problems here. But a good technical explanation of this comes out of the early days of big data and Hadoop, where what you'd find is people would build what they thought were these powerful data lakes, and they'd realize they can't really work with them. They had to scoop stuff out. That was literally the term of the tool they were using. So scoop it out and put it somewhere else and then work with what they thought was a twin, but it was always a representation. It wasn't the whole thing, and it was always out of date. And what they wanted was real-time information out of the big data, but they couldn't get it to work with it. So they ended up doing these twin things. And one of the aspects of the twinning was that they could do things to the twin that they couldn't do to the full data set. And that was where, again, this was about 10 years ago, I started to see this fall apart. And I realized what you really want is people to have constant updates and integrity in the data in such a way that you can just go back to the real source. And what Forrester called this a couple of years ago was, instead of third-party sets, they called it zero-party sets. And so if you have a zero-party relationship, that's what you want. You don't want third-party, second-party, anything else. And so the digital twin gets into this problem space of You move it over here, and then things happen to it, and it's a representation, and it's inaccurate, and it tends to fall apart, and bad things are done to it, and people say it doesn't matter because it's just a digital version of you. But it actually does matter. It does affect you.
I thought the blockchain was supposed to solve this.
Blockchain. So I think my best take on blockchain is, some people do say you can run your life on a spreadsheet, but not many people have succeeded. I don't think anyone really wants to live in Excel. And blockchain being a ledger has some serious Achilles heels. Like, as an integrity exercise, if you can't change the ledger, then you put bad stuff into it. You have to basically shut the thing down and start over. There's no real good way to keep it up to date with accuracy if you're just sucking up all the bad information too. And this gets back into the concept, GDPR fundamental of I want to erase something that I think is inaccurate. The blockchain doesn't even address that. It doesn't have any way to deal with it. It's a great technology, like in the way that a hospital needs a ledger of, what happened to some degree for billing, but a hospital's not going to run everything on a ledger. There's going to be all kinds of stuff outside the ledger that's just never going to fit into it. So blockchain maybe has a small space for a small purpose, and it's never going to get out of that.
Davi, talk about the implementation of Solid. This is what Interrupt is doing? And I think I said that correctly this time.
Yeah, exactly. So we're giving people the ability to start to run these Solid pods already. So at large scale, so we already have some governments that have signed up and are working on deployments. They're already at production. And so we're giving people the ability to have a personal data store. So for example, if you become a citizen and you get a personal data store from birth or any point in your life, you can put all the information about you into this place, and then the apps that you interact with would start to read from this data store. And you can have multiple data stores, different aspects of your life. And so Interrupt is just enabling people to have the ability to have the data in a place where they can control access to it and consent grants and be understood fundamentally. The governments are interested in this because as an infrastructure play, of course, it makes sense that you want all the technology to be built on sort of a common standard playing field. And it enables government services like you wouldn't believe, right? So it's your driver's license essentially.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we've talked about the driver license thing, right? But like part of this equation that has to be solid, if you will, is the authentication and authorization aspect of it. Otherwise, someone could compromise the integrity of your data pod.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting questions we get often is like, aren't you just centralizing all the data now and giving people one place to attack it? And so it's a great thought exercise because people go after, and PCI is a perfect example of this, people go after the 10,000 or 10 million credit cards in the big data store. They don't go after 10 million individual users who have 5 credit cards each because they put them in their wallet, right? It's the opportunistic attacks have tended to go after the warehouses of information. So it's true that you're centering the information around yourself, but actually leads to higher integrity and a greater chance of catching an attack because you understand what's right, wrong, and what should or shouldn't be happening in your own world. Whereas if you give it to someone else and it goes off, it's more targeted and you have no idea something happened, and that's where breach notification laws came from.
Do you think this can address some of the issues around like voting and the problems we have with identity? Like Social Security number was never designed to be an identity per se, and we've leveraged that for how long after that? How come, do you think this is going to address an issue where we should be using something like a digital PGP signing cert in order to vote, so we have a ledger of who's voted when, where, and how that's all accounted for? Can that be something that addresses a societal issue to solve bigger problems?
I think a lot of the voting issues are solved by paper still, so I'm not sure I want to move away from that. That's sort of the simple answer, but it's the thing about this, like the web, it's an extension of the web. It's like just moving the web to its next iteration because it's solving for integrity and identity. So yes, like it's saying, who can have a web server? Well, I mean, anybody for anything. So can it solve for it? Yeah, it can. It definitely can have verifiable credentials, for example, or VCs or digital identifiers, DIDs are all part of this. And so if you go into the W3 spec and look at the VCs and the DIDs and all these acronym soups, you find that it definitely is a place where you could say, I voted, here's a record of my vote, here's a proof of my identity that's from an authority. And I say from an authority because, of course, you could have multiple levels of it. You could be authority from the city, it can be an authority from the state, it can be authority from the federal government, it can be authority. And so you get into this, like, who issued the credential and what is your voting scope, what does your role-based access control allow you based on your credential? You can vote in the federal, you can vote in the Republican, but you can't vote in the Democrat, that kind of stuff. It can solve all of that because it's a way of manifesting your life in a digital format. It takes technology and fits it to the human condition, as opposed to most technology, which takes the human and tries to stuff it into this thing and say, I bet you're going to like this. And it turns out to be not so great.
How do we preserve the integrity of the data in something like a digital license? Because we've talked about that and how it's kind of a bad idea because it's used as an identity, but part of that identity is verifying my age, for example. If I'm in control of that data, I can easily forge it if it's in digital form. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, Davi.
Yeah, I had to deal with this a lot in terms of Worm, right? Write once, read many, WRM. And Worm was very, very popular in financial institutions where everything that was ever said by anyone dealing with any kind of investments had to be tracked, like the very letter. I also dealt with this a lot in super large cloud environments where we had lots and lots of people getting into lots and lots of systems that we just didn't have great ways of logging. So we ended up going to key loggers across jump hosts. And so I say that because administrators have, God level access and in an environment where you want them to be constantly traced so you could prove that they did something wrong, but they were God. And this is an ancient philosophical problem too, where you have sort of inherited rights versus controlled rights. Inherited rights in the model of the 1700s was like, you can be wrong because you inherit a system of judgment. So if you're root, somebody who hired you can say, hey, I didn't hire you to do that, root. Whereas in a controlled environment, you say, well, I'm root, so it's me who decides whether it's right or wrong. You have no way to say. I'm in control of the thing that decides whether I'm right. So it's very dangerous to end up in a controlled space. You want to be in an inherited space. That's where we get the CIS guys and the OWASP and all that stuff that come in and say, this is right based on a agreed upon standard. And so back to the question, like, how do you deal with integrity where people can change things? You focus first philosophically on this sort of concept of inherited rights. And then secondarily, you go into concepts like Worm that say, I'm going to move stuff into a place that you can't touch it. And so we have sort of a secondary. And we run into this already with people asking us about utilities, for example. So I have a personal data store. I light up all these you guys were talking about computers before and the wattages. And, what if I report that I'm using 200 watts and I'm actually using 700 watts because I'm tampering with the utility information before the utility company can read it? And so that's a real problem. And so you end up with ways of having multiple pods. You have Worm pods. You have ways of integrity being handled by someone who can read but not write, or write but just not read. All kinds of interesting ways. The technology can solve it, but the problem is that you have to architect it.
Yeah. Because like your birth date is a piece of data that should not change. Like you can't change that. So that has to be protected in the architecture as you described it.
Yeah, and fundamentally, even birthdays can change. It's weird, but it happens. And birthdays vary by culture too. You find some people assign them earlier than other people. And it's and that's the weird world of the web, is that everything is up for grabs in a world that's relative but also absolute. What I mean by that is there's time. Time is absolute, but time zones are relative. It's like gravity is absolute, but the planet you're on has a different level of it. And so you have to understand like how to manifest these technology. What I'm trying to build is a control that says, somebody's going to be an administrator and somebody's going to be a main user and somebody's going to be a lower level user or have lower levels of access. And there's going to be levels of rising up, but it's not going to be always the same. And people are going to have to figure out what's right for their environment.
One thing that's also sticking in my mind, Davi, is you mentioned that you had to help a company get control of their robots. Can you talk about that more without disclosing too much?
Yeah, I mean, I can disclose as much as I suppose is reasonable. Process automation is where it started, and so there's a lot of robotic process automation, RPAs, and there was a lot of people writing scripts essentially that turned into sort of self-perpetuating things that would be able to write its own. I can't say it's sentient or conscious, that's just ridiculous, but it was able to sort of do a lot of things. And in classic fashion, the people that set it up didn't comment it and didn't articulate it and probably didn't. Anyone who's ever done auditing knows this. You go into an environment, you say, what does this stuff do and what does that stuff do? And people go, I don't know, Bob set that up and he left 10 years ago. And so this is a classic case in that sense where these robots were set up and then going off and doing things that were fairly powerful. And the people who were now running the company at this very large global scale were like, help. If we turn off these robots, do bad things happen? And if we don't turn them off, do bad things happen? Which to me was like flashback to Blade Runner, where you're like, you got the wrong guy. I just want to eat my noodles.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting how it's not autonomous, but technology seems to run on its own. I think we've all been in that scenario where, well, things just run, like don't touch it, and that's kind of scary because it means you really don't have control over it.
Well, transparency comes back. Is can you audit it? That's the fundamental of a robot that's doing things. Is again to the inherited rights. Well, is this robot working within the space that it's defined, allowed to work within, or is it doing things outside that space? Well, people didn't define the space. Okay, let's define it. What is it allowed to do? And I'll test it. And then I'm going to measure it and see if it's operating normally. And this is, for me, this is such fascinating stuff because what you find, for example, with Teslas is that they're able to do some horrible, horrible things and get away with it. But I've seen cases where like a 4-year-old picks a flower at a bus stop and they get a day in jail. And it's just incredible to me, the different levels at which we measure people in society. You see that the Tesla as a robot fails constantly. Well, let me take it out of the Tesla camp and put it in the Google camp. They went to Nevada to test.
I was going to have you put it in the Twitter camp, given recent events, because I think some of what we've talked about today. I mean, you can comment as much or as little as you want, Davi. Right? That's not where I'm going. But what we've talked about, right, with controlling your data and controlling who has access to the data, are some things that are in the allegations against Twitter.
Right. I have a long history with Twitter. So I, a long time ago, was finding that they were extremely biased in their handling of information. And I actually went inside Twitter and met with people, and I found myself embroiled in what seemed to be management that didn't want to do the right thing. And so this was, I think, a dirty secret in Silicon Valley for a long time. I don't know, 10 years now at least. People have known it's been kind of a garbage management style of the company. Now things have changed here and there, but I think, yeah, it gets to, you would expect of a kind of platform like that they would be working to some inherited standard by which they would make decisions, but it was actually very opaque, and they were making decisions about people that were very purposeful, but not exposed. For example, they had an agenda.
Yeah.
They harmed women. They just straight up harmed women, and then they let Nazis run rife. That was one of the things I ran into, was they were perfectly okay with Nazi speech because they're like, hey, free speech, got to let it out, got to have it all. If you don't do absolute freedom, then, society collapses. And then you'd say, okay, we just shut down, like 10,000 women's accounts for having bare nipples. And they're like, that stuff's too much. Like, you just can't have that. It'll destroy society if you let that kind of thing out. And it just seemed entirely hypocritical and totally disconnected from the actual, like, philosophical pedigree. Like, if they had hired people who actually understood speech and philosophy or the law, then I don't think they would have done any of the stuff they're doing.
Well, I mean, all the major social networks do that to some degree, right? I mean, and you can kind of see their biases, whether it's extreme as some of the examples that you gave, or it's just like, I know if I post something that says I'm looking to hire someone, that on certain platforms where I can pay to advertise that job, like, my post goes right down to the bottom of the pile. Like, so there's biases in many different fashions in social media. I think that's always been my fear in these large social networks.
One of the weirdest things I found with Twitter was I did a bunch of experiments a while ago, and I did a bunch of research, and I didn't really report a lot of it. I didn't publish. I just got so much to do in so little time. But I was able to set up accounts that couldn't see other accounts. So, for example, I would set up an account, and then I would try to post things, and then the other accounts couldn't see it because they were basically dissecting communities and preventing you from seeing certain accounts, even though the premise was you're basically on an open forum, like a town square, and anyone can see you speaking. But in fact, what they're doing is building all these walls around people and only allowing certain people to see certain things. And I found that to be extremely disingenuous. I found the fact that I could set up 5 accounts and like 3 of them couldn't see the other 2 posting. In fact, one of them said that it was being blocked by the other one, even though I controlled all the accounts and there was no blocking going on. So they were definitely in there manipulating and massaging and controlling people's.
I think many of us have seen that too. Like, you post something on Facebook, like, hey, did you see my post? No. Well, why didn't the algorithm show it to you? It showed it to other people.
That's why I didn't get your invitation.
It didn't show it to you.
And this is exactly my point about the power of the web as it was on a clean forum, like where you could actually put it out and anybody in the world could see it. I publish my own blog now. I have since 95, really.
Yeah.
And 1995, I run my own. So if you go to my blog, you see unvarnished information. If you have a clean infrastructure and you can read anything, you can see my blog just as it's written. And that was the power of the web as it was intended. Now, a lot of people would argue nobody wants to run their own server, but I think that gets into the wrong side of the equation. It's not that it's like nobody wants to work on their own car. That's just absolutely not true. Some people still like it. I take cars apart all the time, completely down to the bolts and put them back together.
Nice.
Some people really like, it's the hot rodding is a real thing for the hacker community, the right to repair.
But the thing with your blog, though,
that gets into
any blog is we have to now trust Google. They're going to show you in their search results to a certain extent.
Take that one step further, Paul. Like, we have to inherently trust DNS and those that run DNS and the root servers and the people that can control whether routing to those DNS actually does what it's supposed to do. So we are inherently at somewhat the same masters to an extent.
IPFS, totally decentralized file system. Come on, it'll work just fine.
Web3 will fix this. The blockchain's got us.
Yeah, we go with blockchain.
I am not a crook.
There's actually
rug puller.
There's actually a presentation by Tim now where he talks about how Web3 has nothing to do with the blockchain. His vision of the next web is completely separate from and doesn't involve blockchain. And what's interesting to me is we find blockchain people saying to us, hey, you seem like a really good thing for us. We need you as infrastructure for us to run on top of. Right? For example, an NFT needs a place to put its image. It doesn't really have any infrastructure for the actual thing that it's purporting to try to sell it. And so it has this way of ascribing a ledger. Again, it's going to have a spreadsheet of who bought and who sold, but it's not going to have a place for the actual thing that you bought and sold. And so that's why, yes, you're dependent on DNS. Yes, but my point is you can manage the infrastructure to a certain degree. This gets into the whole net neutrality and so forth. But that's the purpose of representative government, is to create those fair spaces on which people can operate. So if you agree that people should have a road, and then you agree the types of cars that can operate on it, you're in a much better place than if you just sew it all up and the only people who can operate it are like the brother of the king, right? All the buses in this country are owned by the cousin of the brother of the king, and all the tires for the buses are owned. And I've actually studied this. There was a brief period where I went into a country in Asia and I studied exactly that. I studied the fall of a monarchy and how the parliamentary system he tried to bring up fell apart because of the interfighting in the political systems for the infrastructure of technology. So yeah, we need open marketplace, and we need managed systems. It's sort of the liberal democracy model that we've seen. So if you take political science and history and you put it over here into the Twitter sphere, there's actually very easy, obvious solutions. But the fact is the people who were running the company didn't want those. They were in a completely different mind space of how they wanted things to look.
More questions, comments? For
we could have a better Twitter simply by the fact that, as you say, like, people have to discover my blog, sort of. But at the same time, I'll be frank, I don't care if people discover my blog. For me, publishing stuff and getting the word out to a few people is as good as me getting out to 3 million people. I'm not in it to get discovered as much as I am to be high integrity. And if I get somebody who comes and says, you're totally wrong about barbed wire, I'm like, that's great. That's what I want to hear. Let me go back.
We did have a really in-depth discussion about barbed wire. I have to say, that was the first time on the show we did that. I thought it was great.
I can actually make Davi twitch. I just found out about 10 seconds ago that Amazon is shutting down their health service, the medication, basically, because they bought an entire chain of managed care clinics, and they're going to roll everything up together. So when you want to talk about aggregation of data, like, wow.
Yeah, this was a long time ago, too. I was asked by pharmaceuticals, like, they're the big 900-pound gorilla, if you will, behind the little shops that you go into. You walk into a pharmacy and you know somebody, mom and pop shop that's been there forever, and you say, I want to get this or that pill. Behind the scenes, there's a huge amount of information being sucked up. And I used to work on building these big data systems. And so I used to have to deal with some of the ethical questions around how much should they reveal that they know about these people walking into these, mom and pop relationships? And how much should they reveal about, the information they're using to cure cancer? And that gets back to the point. Like, if you know how your information is being used, you may consent to it being used and even provide more information and do it in a way that you can pull the consent back when you feel like it's not being used in a way that's consistent with your values. And that's a better system than what was happening, which is behind the scenes, mass aggregation, monopolization, digital moats, all your information feeding into a system you can't get out of and you have no control over, and then it becomes unfair and it's too late. What are you going to do? You're stuck. So that's where we're at, and that's why governments are stepping in to represent the people's interest. But it shouldn't be laws, it shouldn't be governments, it shouldn't be regulations, it should be technology. We have the capability, and that's what Solid represents. We have the ability to give people control over their data. We just have to roll it out.
Any more questions for Davi? Things that you guys wanted to bring up?
No.
I think the pharmaceutical thing is interesting in that the U.S. is the U.S. one of the only countries that allows pharmaceuticals to advertise on television? I haven't actually done the research on it. We were talking about pharmaceuticals. I thought it was another kind of weird thing in the pharmaceutical industry here in the U.S. They're allowed to advertise.
I know they deregulated quite a bit under Ronald Reagan. Like the whole idea of advertising was completely changed in 86 or 84. This is an interesting point in history because even the people who owned the hardware, the lines, right? The television producers and advertisers were working together before that in a way that was sort of a detente. And Ronald Reagan came in and said, forget that. I don't even care what the people who own the infrastructure think. We're going to push whatever we want over their wires. And removed all protections to children, farm, everything. And that was weird when you see that the industry is saying, hey, we should really protect children. You know, we don't want our wires to be used for things that are going to hurt children. And Ronald Reagan's like, who cares about children?
I know we're going long, but I just realized something that just blew me away. I apologize.
Is it about barbed wire?
No. It's not barbed wire. Okay, it's razor ribbon. It's stuff you put around prisons. No, just kidding. Davi, I went through I've been going through the solid documentation, and I've been like, something's tugging at the back of my skull, and no, it's not the remnants of the hair there. Do you remember a program, Diaspora, a long time ago, that 3 kids were developing, one of them committed suicide, and they stopped. It was one of the first, we're going to let you build your own social media pod, or and I think they even use the word pod, and you control your own data.
Yeah, I do remember this. Yeah. And actually, one of the interesting things is
very similar.
There's
MySpace, that's what it was.
There's a lot of these all over the world. No. That's what's so interesting is, I think the brilliance of Tim is that what he puts forward is what everyone's thinking, but he does it in a way that's extremely practical, right? HTML as a exercise in hyperlinking or linking things together had many precedents. I was working in HyperCard on the Mac, and there's all kinds of ways of link graphs and link data and following. I don't remember Choose Your Own Adventures, and there was like Ace of Aces. There were games that were like just following links that were connected. But what he does so brilliantly is he makes it real. And so very quickly, he moved from the concepts that everyone had. Why don't we just have the right to our own data? Why don't we have the ability to control our data? Why can't we write apps that have a hypervisor essentially that talk to our data through an abstraction layer? So I can pull out the app and pull in a new app, grab an identity from different identity providers depending on who I want to be in a relationship with. And boom, in a few years, he's basically prototyped it and we're running. And so that's what we're doing, is we're actually making stuff real. And a lot of people can make things happen, but he can make things happen at a global scale like I've never seen before. And that's what the web has been my whole career.
Davi, if folks want to learn more, is it solidproject.org? And then there's other resources in the show notes, but I want you to be able to promote where you want to drive people to learn more about this topic.
As long as they don't drive a Tesla, they should go look at the solidproject.org is a great place to look. And interrupt.com, of course, is where we're building the enterprise server. The enterprise server, there's a community server, there's open source. There's a lot of stuff that's open source that people can grab and play with. The concept of the enterprise server is that it should be able to scale to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of users. And so it's got a lot of security and availability stuff built in, that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Davi, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Thank you, guys. Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, wait. We're going to do 5 questions.
Yeah, don't screw it up like I did last week.
I forgot. We have five questions. They're kind of silly, and there's no right or wrong answer. Are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly, Davi?
I'm ready.
3 words to describe yourself.
Whew.
That's
3 words to describe myself. How much time do I get?
Enough to say 3 words.
That's how much time do I get? That's too many words.
And might have been one of them.
Hoof was one of them. All right, so we're hyphenating. That's cool. If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Spoon.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Rain.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Oh man, there's so many. I think the 419s, because they're just so unrepresented. I love the documentary about the 419s.
Yeah.
414s. What am I saying?
Is it 414? I thought it was 414.
No, it's 419.
419
419 scams?
419 scam?
419?
Yeah.
Yeah, 419.
Not 419. It's the 414s. It's the Milwaukee area code. The 414s are the kids who really in 1985, 1986 were super influential in the hacking scene. The CFAA basically came out as a response to what was going on with the 414s in Milwaukee.
Yes. I don't think I've watched the documentary about that. It might have been mentioned in some of the books I've read, but yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Went to Sundance. It was like I was super into it for a while. I was trying to promote it. It didn't really get any press or notoriety, but it's fundamental to understanding American hacking culture and the transition. The 414s were huge in my upbringing. I thought I was late. 1986, everything's being hacked to death. All the hospitals are being taken offline. I thought, man, how do I get in on this train? At 1986, it feels like it's already over. And then today, people are like,
Davi, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
I don't do celebrities.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Can be anyone from history, fictitious or a real person.
And your very own parents could be a celebrity in your own mind.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were pretty good parents. I have to say they put me on the right track. But I am fascinated by Hume. David Hume and Wollstonecraft, I think, would be the 2.
Cool.
Outstanding.
Nice.
Davi, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.